There is a door in the mind you have never noticed, because you have spent your whole life standing on the far side of it, calling that side the world. What arrives when you open your eyes? The wall, the lamp's warm circle, the ordinary furniture of the room, a chair, a windowsill, the fold of a curtain, feels like reality delivered whole and unedited, straight through the glass of you. It is not. It is a rendering. Somewhere behind your forehead, a vast, patient machinery is taking a flood of raw signal, light, pressure, the hum of your own blood, and quietly deciding what reaches you and what is thrown away. And it is very, very good at hiding its own hand. You almost never catch it working. That is the point of it. There is a dial on that machinery. You have never touched it. Most people live and die without knowing it is there. And a small family of molecules, a scatter of white powder, the grey-green flesh of a cactus, a dried mushroom, the milked sweat of a toad, a bitter vine simmered overnight in a pot, drawn from places as far apart as a Basel laboratory and the mist of the Amazon, can reach in and turn it. The dial has a real name, or at least the thing it is wired to does. On the surface of certain neurons, thickest across the wrinkled outer crust of your brain where thinking happens, sits a receptor called 5-HT2A. It is a lock. Your own serotonin is one of its keys. It taps the lock. The door opens a crack. The door swings shut. That is ordinary life. That gentle tapping goes on inside you every second of this sentence. Welcome to Pharmasomnia, soothing, fascinating pharmacology to drift off to. If your mind likes to wander as you fall asleep, subscribe and rest easy. But some of these molecules do not tap and let go. They slide into the lock and stay, holding it open far longer than nature intended. And while it is held open, something shifts in the way the whole system decides what is real. There is one more piece to name, because you will meet it again and again as we climb. Deep in the brain runs a network that lights up when nothing in particular is happening. When you are not doing a task, only drifting, narrating yourself to yourself. Researchers call it the default mode network. You might call it the narrator. It is the voice that keeps the story of you continuous from moment to moment, that stitches the ragged edges of experience into a single seamless self and files everything neatly under me, here, now. It is the filter. And the strangest, most consistent finding of the last 20 years is this. When these molecules take hold, the narrator goes quiet. The filter loosens. And as it loosens, the world it was holding back begins to come through. Here is where honesty has to enter the story, softly, the way it will keep entering. Because we can trace the molecule to the receptor. We can watch the narrator dim on a scanner, a warm patch of the map going cool. We can map every step of the chemistry, and then we arrive at a cliff, and the science simply stops. Nobody, not one researcher alive, can tell you why a molecule sitting on a receptor becomes a color you have never seen, a memory from when you were 4, a certainty that you have died, a voice, a presence, a God. The distance between the physical event and the felt experience has never been crossed. It is the oldest unsolved gap there is, and it sits right at the center of everything we are about to explore. Hold that lightly. We are going to walk to the edge of it, more than once, and simply look over. The first person to fall through that door did it by accident. In 1943, in wartime Switzerland, a chemist named Albert Hofmann was working with compounds drawn from ergot, a dark, horn-shaped fungus that grows on rye. He had made one of them 5 years earlier, labelled it, set it aside as uninteresting. Then, one spring day, a strange restlessness made him go back to it, and a trace of it, absorbed through the skin of his fingertips, was enough. The laboratory began to soften and stream. He went home and lay in a twilight of shapes and colours, unsure what he had done to himself. Days later, he decided to find out on purpose. He measured what he was sure was a tiny, cautious dose, 1/4 milligram, 250 millionths of a single gram, and swallowed it. He thought it was almost nothing. It was something like 5 times a full dose. What followed sent him cycling home through streets that had come loose from their moorings, convinced he was dying, or losing his mind, or already gone, and that ride, that 19th of April, is remembered now as Bicycle Day. The molecule was LSD, and the wonder buried in it, the thing that still ought to stop you, is the scale. A substance that rearranges the entire theatre of a human consciousness in an amount too small to see, too small to taste, a few millionths of a gram resting on the tip of a finger. Nothing else people put into their bodies works at doses so vanishingly small. It was the first hint that the dial is exquisitely, almost frighteningly sensitive, that consciousness is balanced on a hair. So that is where we are. There is a dial in your brain you have never touched, a lock called 5HT2A, a narrator that can be quieted, a gap at the center that no one has closed, and a whole family of molecules, each turning the same dial by a different amount and in its own strange way, waiting further up. We are going to climb them, one rung at a time, the gentlest first, barely a whisper against the ordinary world, and then higher and higher into the truly strange. You do not have to hold any of it. Let the names and the numbers wash over you and drift on. Each step up is only a small turn of the dial, and the filter loosening by a degree, and you sinking a little deeper into the dark, warm and safe, and going nowhere at all. Let yourself settle. We begin the climb one rung higher. Level 1. LSD, roughly 5 micrograms. So little it barely earns the word dose. 5 millionths of a gram, a speck you could lose in the seam of a fingernail, and yet somewhere in the folds of your cortex it finds a keyhole cut exactly to its shape. This is the wonder to sit with before anything else, that a substance can be real at a scale this small. Most poisons, most medicines, ask for milligrams, whole, visible grains. The classic serotonergic psychedelics ask for almost nothing. LSD is the most potent of them all, active in the millionths where its cousins work in the thousands, and at 5 micrograms it does not open the door. It only leans against it. You feel nothing you could name. Perhaps the day carries a faint gloss, a warmth you'd have blamed on coffee or good sleep. The filter has not loosened. It has only remembered that it can. Level 2. LSD, around 10 micrograms. The microdose proper. The world is unchanged, and you are a fraction more willing in it. This is the rung a psychologist named James Fadiman spent years mapping, quietly, patiently, the sub-perceptual band, the dose taken to work rather than to leave the world behind. Through the 2010s, his protocols drifted out of Northern California and into the open-plan offices of Silicon Valley, where engineers began seeding 10-microgram Tuesdays into their weeks, chasing focus, ease, a softer edge on the day. The story became a movement, and here is where you should let the honest thing settle over you like a cool sheet. When researchers finally ran it properly, placebo against microdose, blind, the effect kept dissolving. Trial after careful trial landed on maybe not. People felt better, so did the ones swallowing nothing. Whether 10 micrograms of LSD does anything at all beyond what you expect of it is right now genuinely unsettled. Not debunked, not proven, simply open, a question still lying on the table. Level 3, psilocybin, about 1/10 of a gram of dried mushroom. We cross now from the laboratory-precise molecule to the older, stranger one that grows in cow fields and on the mulch of forgotten gardens. And here is a subtlety worth holding as you drift. What you swallow is not quite what works on you. Psilocybin is a prodrug, inert as taken, a key still wrapped in paper. Your own body unwraps it, strips away a phosphate group and turns it into psilocin, and it is psilocin that finds the receptor. 1/10 of a gram is barely a whisper of that. A faint brightening at the edges, if anything, more mood than vision. Level 4, psilocybin, around 2/10 of a gram. One rung higher and still beneath the threshold of anything you'd call an effect. But let the receptor itself come into focus now, because it is the same lock every rung in this band is testing. It is called 5-HT2A, a serotonin receptor strewn thickest across the outer crust of the brain, the thinking layer. Your own serotonin brushes against it 1,000 times a day and lets go, brush and release, brush and release. That letting go is the point. These molecules do not brush and release, they settle in and they stay. Level 5, LSD, around 15 micrograms. And this is where the strangest small fact of the whole band belongs, the one worth carrying down into sleep. For decades, no one quite knew why an LSD experience lasts so long. 12 hours, sometimes more, absurd for so few molecules, long since flushed from the blood. Then, in 2017, a laboratory grew the receptor and the molecule together and looked. The LSD had slipped into the 5-HT2A pocket, and a loop of the receptor had folded down over the top of it, like a lid closing on a jar. The molecule was trapped, held under its own little roof, released only slowly, one slow escape at a time. And that, they think, is why the day stretches so long. A speck of a thing, locked in place, running the clock from inside. Even here at 15 micrograms, where you feel almost nothing, that lid is quietly closing. Level 6, psilocybin, around 1/4 of a gram. The dial turns, barely. Colours sit a touch more saturated, the way they do in the first minute after rain, when the pavement darkens and the leaves look freshly painted. And it is worth remembering, in the hush of this rung, how recently all of this was ordinary knowledge and then wasn't. In 1957, a banker named R. Gordon Wasson published an account in Life magazine of a night in the Oaxacan mountains in the house of a Mazatec healer named Maria Sabina, who fed him the mushrooms her people had kept sacred and hidden for centuries. Millions read it over breakfast. It was the first time most of the modern West had heard of any of this, and it lifted a thing from a mountain village and set it loose in the world, with consequences, for her, that no one had asked her to bear. Level 7, LSD, around 18 micrograms. Near the top edge of the subperceptual band, and honesty asks for a flag here too, planted gently. We still cannot say what these doses do inside a single brain. We can watch the receptor, we can see the lid close. But the distance between a molecule settling into a pocket and a person feeling, faintly, that the day is kinder, that distance is not crossed by anything science can yet show you. The gap is real. It sits under all of this, unbridged. Level 8, psilocybin, around 0.3 of a gram. The filter thins, not lifts, thins, the way fog goes from wall to gauze without your catching the moment. There may be a faint drift toward the visual now at the far edges of your seeing, a suggestion of movement where a wall meets the light, a breathing that stops the instant you turn to look at it. Nothing declares itself. Everything is very slightly more. Level 9, LSD, around 20 micrograms. The ceiling of the threshold band. One more rung and we would leave the subperceptual behind. Sit here a moment on the sheer improbability of the ledger. 20 millionths of a gram, and a nervous system built of 100 billion cells has tilted measurably toward the strained. No other class of molecule buys so much change with so little matter. This is the fact the whole ascent rests on. The potency is the wonder. Level 10, psilocybin, around 0.5 gram. And here, at the top of the threshold, comes the first true shimmer. Not a vision, not the door swinging open. Only the first honest sign that the filter, the quiet narrator that stitches your world into one seamless, sensible whole, has thinned enough to notice its own thinning. A breath of unfamiliarity in a familiar room. The edges of things holding a half-second too long. The filter has not lifted. It has only, for the first time, become something you can feel the shape of. One rung higher, and it begins in earnest. Level 11, LSD, roughly 25 micrograms. The threshold. This is where the ascent stops being a matter of mood and becomes, for the first time, a matter of perception. Though only barely, only at the very edge of what you could swear to. 1/4 of 100 millionths of a gram, less than a speck of flour on a fingertip, and the room begins, very gently, to breathe. The straight edge of the windowsill develops the faintest reluctance to stay straight. If you look at it head-on, it holds, and if you let your eyes drift, it bows a hair and settles. The green of a leaf on the sill sits one shade deeper inside its own outline, as though someone had leaned on the color. You could still deny all of it. That deniability is the signature of the threshold, the place where the filter has loosened just enough that you notice the loosening, and not yet enough that you lose the argument about whether it is real. Level 12, LSD, 35 micrograms. Here the deniability begins to thin. The mechanism underneath has not changed since the lower rungs. It is the same small molecule finding the same ancient listening post, the serotonin receptor called 5-HT2A, scattered thickest across the outer crust of the brain, the thinking layer, the cortex. What changes is only how many of those receptors are held open at once, and for how long. The molecule slips into the pocket, and the receptor folds a kind of lid down over it, closing it in like a hand cupping a moth, and it will not easily let go. Which is why the day stretches so long, why the tide goes out at breakfast, and does not come back in until the street lights are on. 8 hours, 10, 12. One rung higher is not a stronger key. It is more of the same doors, propped a little wider, held a little longer. Level 13, psilocybin, 0.5 gram of dried mushroom. We cross now from the laboratory glass to the forest floor, from a Swiss molecule drawn up with a pipette to something with damp earth still on it, older than writing. 0.5 gram is the mushroom's own threshold, the faint edge, the tilt you might mistake for tiredness or for the loose-limbed clarity that comes at the far end of a long walk. What you swallow is not yet the active thing. Psilocybin is a prodrug. Your body strips a single phosphate group from it, the way you twist a stem off a fruit, and what is left is psilocin. And it is psilocin that reaches the same 5-HT2A post the LSD found, by a different road, from a different kingdom of life entirely. A fungus and a chemist arriving at the same lock. That coincidence is not really a coincidence. It is the deep strangeness this whole ascent keeps circling. Level 14, psilocybin, 0.75 gram. Somewhere around here, the thing that had only been felt becomes, for the first time in this story, measurable. In the early 2010s, at Imperial College in London, a researcher named Robin Carhart Harris slid volunteers one by one into the white throat of an fMRI scanner and gave them psilocybin, expecting, as everyone expected, to watch the brain light up, blaze, overload. Instead, certain regions went dark. Specifically, a linked set of hubs called the default mode network, the brain's idling circuit, the narrator, the part that murmurs on whenever you are thinking about yourself, replaying the argument you lost, rehearsing the one you haven't had yet. Under the mushroom, it powered down, the way a house goes quiet room by room. The filter, it turned out, had an address. And when the narrator falls quiet, the rest of the brain begins talking to itself in ways it normally never does. Level 15, LSD, 50 micrograms. Carhart Harris had a name for what he was seeing: the entropic brain. Ordinarily, your cortex is a disciplined thing, regions keeping to their lanes, vision speaking only to vision, sound only to sound. Each river in its own channel, cut deep by a lifetime of use. Raise the dose and the banks grow porous. In the scans, parts of the brain that ordinarily have nothing to say to each other begin to reach across. A sprawling, unfamiliar web of crosstalk lighting up over the dry ground where no river ran before. More disorder, more possibility, more freedom in the system. Entropy, in the physicist's sense, the sheer number of ways a thing is free to arrange itself. The self is not being poisoned here. It is being unconstrained. The tight, efficient, predictable machine you live inside is, for a few hours, allowed to go loose in its joints. Level 16, psilocybin, 1 gram. And out of that loosening, at this height, something genuinely uncanny begins to surface. The senses stop keeping to their lanes. You hear a sound and see it, a struck piano note arriving as a slow bloom of violet, a voice with a grain you could run a thumb across, a smell with edges and a shape. Synesthesia, the crossing of the wires. Music becomes the most common doorway. People close their eyes and watch it move. And here is the honest part, the part the science will not let us slip past cleanly. We do not fully know why this happens. The tidy story says the loosened cortex is simply leaking, the sound regions bleeding into the sight regions across those newly built bridges. But the tidy story does not quite fit all the data, and the crossing has a strange specificity to it. This note, this color, again and again, that nobody has fully explained. It is a real effect with an incomplete cause. Level 17, mescaline, a low dose, somewhere near 200 milligrams, a third road to the same crossing. Mescaline is the slow one, drawn from cactus, the flat grey-green peyote button of the North American deserts, the tall ribbed San Pedro of the Andes, and it has been swallowed in ceremony far longer than either the mushroom or the molecule from the lab. It, too, finds 5-HT2A. It, too, loosens the filter. But it comes on like weather rather than a tide, a whole long day of it moving through, gentler in its geometry, warmer in its color, more amber than the cool silvers of the others. Three utterly different-looking things. A fungus, an ergot derivative wrung from a grain mold, a cactus alkaloid, and one shared listening post beneath them all. The ascent keeps handing you the same key, cut from different metals. Level 18, and here the path forks, because the next thing you meet is not one of them at all. MDMA, roughly 100 milligrams. It looks like it belongs on this ladder, and it does not. This is the great detour, and it deserves to be named as such. MDMA is not a classic psychedelic. It does not prop the 5-HT2A door and wait for visions. It is a releaser. It walks into the nerve terminals and runs the serotonin pumps in reverse, forcing a flood of serotonin out into the synapse all at once, dragging dopamine and norepinephrine along in the current, and, crucially, lifting oxytocin, the chemistry of bonding and trust. The result is not a warping of the walls, it is a warming of the room. Not the filter loosening, the heart loosening. Level 19, MDMA, 125 milligrams, near the top of a common dose. What this gives is closeness. The armor you did not know you were wearing simply is not there. The reflex to guard, to flinch, to hold the difficult thing out at arm's length goes slack. People weep without grief and say, plainly, across a kitchen table, the sentence they have carried unspoken for 20 years. It has a history stitched right through the culture, first made in 1912 and then set on a shelf and forgotten, then resurrected in the 1970s in the home lab of a chemist named Alexander Shulgin, who tasted his own compounds, one careful gram at a time, and wrote down what each one did to him, and who handed this one to therapists before it ever reached a dance floor. Then the dance floor found it, and the sweat-slick warehouse raves of the late 1980s, and the ban that followed close behind. Level 20, MDMA again, holding here at the fork before we climb back onto the true ascent. Because the strangest turn in its story is the most recent one. The molecule the law called worthless, no accepted use, pure danger, is now walking back through the front door of medicine, carried into late-stage trials for post-traumatic stress, given in a handful of long, guided sessions while a person turns at last and faces the thing that broke them, with the fear held far enough back that they can keep their eyes on it. What remains unknown is how much of the lasting repair is the chemistry itself, and how much is simply the safety it manufactures, the door it holds open while the real work is done by the person walking through. We do not yet have the clean answer. Rest here a moment, at the top of the detour. One rung higher, and we return to the classic road, where the doses deepen and the filter does not merely loosen, but begins in earnest to come away. Level 21. MDMA. One last look before we leave it behind. Around 110 milligrams now, the far edge of the warm plateau you climbed into a rung ago. And here is the thing the warmth does not tell you, the cost written in fine print beneath the glow. MDMA does its work by running your serotonin transporters in reverse, so the pumps that spend their lives ferrying serotonin back inside the cell now push it the other way, wringing the neuron dry, spilling in one bright rush what it meant to dole out over days. But a flood spent is a flood gone. When the tide goes out, the next morning, the day after, there is a trough where the sea used to be, the wet sand bare, the little pools draining. The old raves had a name for it, Suicide Tuesday. Not because anything is truly broken, but because the well needs days to refill, and until it does, the world runs a little grey, colours half a shade flat, jokes that do not quite land, a low tin taste under everything. This is the quiet law of the whole climb, and MDMA states it more plainly than most. Nothing is given for free. The brightness you borrow on Saturday is repaid, with interest, from Monday's account. Level 22. MDMA again, and the reason it will not stay a party drug. Because somewhere in the emptying, in that great unguarded openness, someone noticed you could steer it. Not toward the dance floor, but toward the thing you have spent your life refusing to look at. Give a person 125 milligrams in a quiet room, no strobes, no crowd, a single lamp, a blanket, a trained pair of hands, and the memory they have been running from for 30 years. And the fear that normally slams the door stays soft on its hinges. The amygdala, your brain's smoke alarm, turns its volume down. Oxytocin rises, the same molecule that floods a mother the hour her child is born. And the horror can be approached the way you would approach a frightened animal, slowly, palms open, without flinching, close enough at last to see it is smaller than the shadow it threw. This is why MDMA sits now in the late stages of clinical trials for post-traumatic stress, why the same molecule that filled a warehouse with strangers holding hands may soon be a prescription. The strangest turn in its whole story. The party drug grew up and became a surgeon of memory. And we still cannot fully say why the empathy comes. The oxytocin is part of it, but not, honestly, the whole of it. That gap remains open. Level 23. And here we step sideways, off the serotonin road entirely, because not every door in this house is cut by the same key. You have been climbing a single stairway so far. LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, even MDMA, all of them laying a hand on some version of the serotonin machine. But there is another stairway running alongside it, built by a different architect, its banister a different wood, and the two rarely speak. Level 23 is where you first feel its draft, a cooler air, sliding under a door you did not know was there. The molecule here does not agitate a receptor into firing. It does the opposite. It blocks. It finds the channel your brain uses to bind its own excitement, glutamate, the accelerator pedal of the nervous system, and it wedges that channel shut, a stone dropped into the gate. Level 24. Ketamine, a low drift, perhaps 20 or 30 milligrams, a taste, and no more. And what a strange taste it is. The classic psychedelics loosen the self. This one seems to detach it, gently, the way a boat slips its mooring and drifts a foot from the dock before anyone notices the rope has gone slack. The mechanism is the whole story. Ketamine is an NMDA receptor antagonist. It plugs the glutamate channel that lets your neurons hand excitement to one another, and with that handoff muffled, the ordinary binding of sensation into a single seamless you, here, now, begins to come apart at the seams. Nothing hurts. Nothing frightens. Not yet. You simply notice that the connection between you and your own body has developed a small, pleasant delay, a half-second of slack in a line that was always taut before. The filter loosens, but through a different loosening than any you have felt so far. Level 25. Ketamine, higher, 60 or 75 milligrams, and the delay becomes a distance. This is the dose that made it a medicine long before anyone called it psychedelic. An anesthetic, first, on battlefields and operating tables, precisely because it can sever mind from pain without stopping the breath. And more recently, something stranger and more hopeful. A single low infusion dripped into the arm of a person sunk in a depression that has resisted every other drug can lift that weight in hours, not weeks, hours, sometimes when nothing else on earth has worked. Nobody fully understands the lift. The leading guess is that blocking NMDA triggers a downstream bloom of new connections, a burst of glutamate elsewhere, dendritic spines regrowing on neurons that had gone bare and smooth as winter branches. Neuroplasticity again, the true and lasting gift under so many of these molecules. But the honest answer, the flagged unknown, is that we are still reverse engineering the very medicine we already prescribe. Level 26. Ketamine near its full dose, and the doorway everyone whispers about. The K-hole. 100 milligrams and more, and the boat does not merely slip its mooring. It is gone from the harbour entirely, out where there is no shore in any direction. People describe it with the same words each time: a fold in space, a machinery to the universe, the sense of being a single point of awareness with no body attached to it at all. It is not the entities of the serotonin drugs, not the walls breathing and running like wax. It is emptier than that, vaster and cooler, a clean cold with no weather in it. And it raises the question this whole detour has been circling. Is dissociation even the same family as psychedelia? One machine excites a receptor, the other blocks a channel. One fills the world with too much meaning until every object hums. The other quietly removes you from the world altogether. They arrive at neighbouring rooms, the self thinned to almost nothing, by opposite doors. Whether that makes them cousins or strangers, no one has settled. Level 27. The dissociatives fanned out, so you know the shape of the family before you leave it. PCP, once sold as an anesthetic too, until the agitation and the strength it lent made it unmanageable. It jams the same NMDA channel, but leaves the user anything but calm. DXM, hiding in a bottle of cough syrup on a bathroom shelf, that same glutamate blockade climbing in strange stepped plateaus the higher the dose. Nitrous oxide, the dentist's gas. 15 seconds of the entire self folding inward down a buzzing metal tunnel, and then the room swings back, ordinary, the light fixture just a light fixture again. Different molecules, different durations, but one shared architecture underneath. The accelerator pedal held flat against the floor, the brain's excitement refusing to pass from cell to cell. A whole wing of the house you did not know was there. Level 28, and one door on this floor you do not open. Set into the wall, low and dark, no lamp above it, is the basement stair, and it is worth naming only so you never mistake it for part of the climb. Datura, the nightshades. Scopolamine and atropine wrung from a roadside weed with white trumpet flowers. These are not serotonin drugs and not glutamate drugs. They are anticholinergics, deliriants, and they work by blacking out acetylcholine, the neurotransmitter that keeps your waking mind tethered to what is actually in the room. The horror of them is precise. The hallucinations are not visions layered over reality, shimmering and obviously unreal. They are seamless, indistinguishable. You hold a conversation with someone in the chair across from you who is not there and never has been, and you never know. People have walked into traffic, torn at their own skin, remembered nothing. This is the one region of the whole map marked only with a warning, no invitation. The filter does not loosen here. It shatters and takes the room down with it. We name the basement so we can close the door and climb. Level 29. Back on the main stair now, the serotonin road under your feet again, the air familiar, the banister warm where your hand has worn it. Everything so far has been approach, the microdose that only tilted your willingness, the threshold where the walls first breathed, the warm plateau of empathy, and this cool sideways corridor of dissociation you have just walked out of. Each was a partial thing, a single instrument sounding alone. But the stairway ahead does not offer instruments one at a time. One rung higher and the doses stop being tastes. The self stops merely thinning and begins, in earnest, to come undone. Level 30. Psilocybin, roughly 2 grams of dried mushroom, and you are standing in the doorway of the full voyage at last. Not over the threshold, in the frame of it, one hand on either jam, the country beyond visible now, and no longer deniable. 2 grams is enough that the eyes closed dark begins to organize itself into geometry, lattices and arches assembling out of the black. Enough that your sense of passing time comes unstuck. Enough that the narrating voice in your head, the one that has been quietly saying, "You, here, now," every waking second of your life, drops to a murmur and, for whole minutes, forgets its lines. That voice has a name in the laboratories, the default mode network, the brain talking to itself about itself. Every molecule on this climb, by its own separate door, arrives at the same quiet act, turning that voice down. The dial turns, the filter loosens, and beyond this doorway the numbers grow serious, and so does what they ask of you. One rung higher and the voyage proper begins. Level 31. LSD, 100 micrograms. Not the threshold now, not the whisper of a dose you could talk yourself out of noticing. This is the real thing, the number that undid Hoffman when he thought he was being cautious. The number that put him wobbling home on his bicycle through a Basel spring, convinced his neighbor was a witch and his body was leaving it. 100 millionths of a gram laid on the tongue, tasteless, weightless, already climbing. And here is the strange arithmetic of it. That speck, a weight you could not feel settle onto your palm, a mass smaller than a single grain of table salt, is enough to occupy the receptors it is looking for and hold them for 10, 12 hours. Because the molecule folds itself into the 5-HT2A receptor and a little lid of protein closes over the top, trapping it there. The reason acid lasts a working day when your own serotonin is gone in seconds. The filter loosens. The walls begin, very gently, to breathe. What is happening up there, in the part of us that keeps the world orderly, is that a network is going quiet. There is a system in the brain that neuroscientists call the default mode network, the low hum that runs when you are doing nothing in particular, staring at a wall, waiting for a kettle. The loom where the sense of I is stitched together thread by thread. The internal narrator that tells you where you end and the room begins. Robin Carhart Harris, imaging tripping brains in London, watched that network fall silent under psilocybin and LSD, and called what replaced it the entropic brain. Less order, more crosstalk, regions that never speak to each other, suddenly comparing notes. That is the loosening. That is the self, thinning at its edges like ink in water. The narrator does not vanish so much as forget its lines. Level 32, psilocybin, 3.5 grams of dried mushroom. The full dose, the one the old measures called an eighth, chewed slow because the taste is earth and bitterness. What you have swallowed is not yet the active thing. Psilocybin is a prodrug, a locked form, and your body has to strip a phosphate off it before it becomes psilocin, the molecule that actually reaches the receptor. So, there is a wait, 40 minutes, an hour of nothing while the enzyme does its quiet work, and then the floor tilts. The same 5-HT2A door, the same crust of the brain lighting up, but a shorter voyage than acid, 4 to 6 hours, because nothing traps this one under a lid. It comes, it works, it leaves. One rung higher, the visuals arrive now, and they are not the faint drifting of the low doses. The carpet organizes itself into slow rivers, the grain of wood becomes a face and then a landscape, and behind your closed eyes, geometry unrolls in colors that seem to have been waiting. And here is one of the great unknowns, the gap nobody can yet close. Why does quieting a network and opening one receptor become this? A specific vision, a particular face, a felt meaning that lands like revelation. We can watch the DMN go dark. We can map the receptor. We cannot tell you why the loosening becomes a garden. Level 33, mescaline, 400 milligrams, the oldest of the classic voyages, older than the word psychedelic, the molecule inside the peyote button and the San Pedro cactus, and the slowest to arrive. An hour, 2, the long climb of a cactus alkaloid. Mescaline reaches the same 5-HT2A receptor as the others, but by a different molecular shape, and the trip it gives is longer than psilocybin, 10 or 12 hours, patient and coloured and deeply visual. This is the drug Aldous Huxley took on a bright May morning in 1954, 0.4 of a gram dissolved in a glass of water, and sat down to watch the world. What Huxley wrote afterward became The Doors of Perception, and the idea at its centre is the one this whole ascent keeps circling. He borrowed a phrase from the philosopher Bergson and made it his own. The brain, he said, is not a generator, but a reducing valve, a filter that narrows the vast flood of what is really there down to the trickle we can survive on and get through the day with. Mescaline, he thought, opened the valve. The flowers on his table became, in his word, a naked existence. A fold of grey flannel trousers turned into an infinite complexity of shadow, and the legs of a chair became the most important thing in the universe. He was describing, in 1954, without the imaging, without the word for it, the filter loosening, the valve and the network, and the lid over the receptor. 3 metaphors for one silence. Level 34. Peyote. 4 buttons, taken not alone, but in a circle that has kept this rhythm for centuries. Because mescaline was never only a molecule, it was a sacrament long before it was a compound in a German laboratory. In the teepee meetings of the Native American church, peyote is eaten through a night of song and water and firelight, the drum passing hand to hand, an all-night prayer that is medicine and church at once. A practice the United States eventually had to carve a specific legal protection around because the sacrament was Schedule 1 and the worship was older than the schedule. The dose is not measured in milligrams there. It is measured in buttons and in hours and in the turning of the night toward dawn. 1 rung higher, the huichol of the Sierra Madre walk to meet it, the pilgrimage to Wirikuta, hundreds of miles across the desert to the high land where the peyote grows, retracing the path the ancestors took, the pilgrims becoming for the journey the gods themselves. They call the cactus hikuri, and they do not take it to escape the world, but to see the world made properly, the way it was at the first sunrise. Here, the strangest thing is not the vision, but the geography of it, that a plant this potent grows in one small, blessed stretch of desert, and that people have walked toward it, deliberately, for a very long time, to have the filter loosened on purpose, in the right place, among the right songs. Level 35. Psilocybin again, but now the mushroom in its own lineage, the one that came to the modern West through a single night in a mountain village in 1955. This is the Mazatec payoff, the thread this ascent has been holding. In the mountains of Oaxaca, a woman named Maria Sabina, a curandera, a healer, held veladas, night vigils by candlelight in which the little mushrooms, the Niños Santos, the holy children, were eaten to see and to heal. She did not do this to trip. She did it to find what was wrong in a sick body, to speak the long-sung poetry of the veladas, the chants that named herself and named the saints, and named the mushrooms speaking through her. And into one of her nights, in 1955, came an American banker named R. Gordon Wasson, who had spent years chasing the rumor that a mushroom cult still lived somewhere in Mexico. She let him eat the holy children. He wrote it up for Life magazine, seeking the magic mushroom, and the door that had stayed shut for 400 years since the Spanish friars tried to burn this practice out of the New World as devilry, blew open. Everything downstream of this ascent, the laboratory psilocybin, the Johns Hopkins Renaissance, the very number on this rung, runs back through Maria Sabina's candlelit floor, 1 rung higher. And the payoff is also a wound, and the house voice will not sand it away. The world Wasson published came for her. Strangers climbed the mountain, looking for the holy children as a thrill. Her neighbors blamed her for giving away what was sacred. Her house was burned, her standing broken, and she died poor, having said near the end that from the moment the outsiders came, the mushrooms lost some of their force, that a thing shared wrongly stops speaking. The filter she had loosened for healing became, in other hands, a commodity. Hold that quietly as you drift. Every rung on this ladder was, somewhere, someone's sacrament first. Level 36. LSD, 150 micrograms. Deeper into the acid country now, past the first hour, into the long plateau where the trapped molecule keeps working under its protein lid, and time itself comes unfastened. The self is soft here. The boundary the default mode network used to draw, this is me, that is the room, this is my hand, that is the light on it, has gone porous, and the light and the hand are no longer so obviously separate things. Nobody yet fully understands why the loosening of that one network feels like becoming the world rather than merely watching it. The map says a network went quiet. The territory says the edges of you dissolved into the afternoon. One rung higher and the dial turns again, and the world is quietly, thoroughly remade. Level 46. Psilocybin. Roughly 2 grams of dried Psilocybe cubensis, and the ground has begun to breathe. This is the dose where the mushroom stops being a mood and becomes a place. Psilocybin, remember, is a prodrug. It does nothing until your liver strips a single phosphate group away and turns it into psilocin. And psilocin is the true traveler, slipping into the 5-HT2A receptors woven thickest through the outer rind of your cortex, the grey few millimeters where thinking happens. One rung higher and the visual field starts to hunt for meaning. A coat over a chair resolves into a watching figure. The grain of the wallpaper knits itself into faces that lean in and withdraw. The default mode network, that low, ceaseless inner voice that narrates you to yourself, that says, "This is me, this is my day," is beginning to turn its volume down. You are still here. You still know your name. But the name feels a little like a coat you could take off. Level 47. Psilocybin, 2.5 grams, and the emotional weather turns vast. What deepens now is not the geometry, but the significance. A memory you had not touched in years surfaces and lands with the weight of prophecy. An ordinary thought about someone you love swells until it fills the whole horizon. This is the register the researchers would one day try to measure, the sense that something enormous is being disclosed. The filter loosens, and with it loosens the ordinary discount you apply to your own inner life, the reflexive shrug that keeps daily feeling manageable. Here, nothing is discounted. Everything is allowed its full size. Level 48. Psilocybin, close to 3 grams, and the boundary of the body begins to negotiate. Where do you end? The question, which never occurs to you sober, becomes a live one. Your hands feel continuous with the air, the skin no longer a wall, but a rumour of one. And it is worth pausing here, in the warm dark, to say plainly what the science still cannot. Nobody knows why quieting that narrating network, why holding open a single serotonin receptor, should feel like the dissolving of a self. The molecular event is charted in detail. The experience it produces is not explained at all. That gap, between the receptor and the revelation, is the great unsolved center of this entire ascent, and you are climbing straight into it. Level 49. Psilocybin, 3.25 grams, and you can feel the threshold just above you, the way the air goes heavy and metal-tasting before a storm. To understand what waits at the next rung, you have to go back to a chapel basement in Boston. Good Friday, 1962. A young physician and divinity student named Walter Pankey had gathered 20 theology students into a low room beneath Marsh Chapel at Boston University, and under the supervision of Timothy Leary, Then, still a respectable Harvard psychologist, he gave half of them psilocybin and half a placebo of niacin, which produces a warm flush and nothing more. Then they all filed upstairs into the pews to hear a Good Friday service piped down through speakers. It was a real experiment, with a real double blind, and what happened in that basement would echo for 60 years. Level 50. Psilocybin, 3.5 grams, the full classic dose, and the world you were standing in is gone. This is the signature rung, the one the whole ascent has been climbing toward, and it deserves to be entered slowly. The visual field is entirely remade, not decorated, remade. Surfaces flowing like glass held too near a flame. Colors arriving that have no name because your eyes have never had cause to name them. The air itself gridded with a fine geometric lace that breathes. Time has come loose from its track. A minute pools into an hour collapses to a breath. And the self, the one who has been narrating this climb, the one who knows its own name, is now the thinnest possible membrane, holding on by a thread it can feel fraying. In that Marsh Chapel basement, this is the dose that took nearly every student who swallowed the real capsule and delivered them, by their own testimony, into something they could only call God. They wept. They wandered the chapel. One had to be gently restrained. Almost all of them, decades later, would describe it as among the most spiritually significant experiences of their entire lives. More real than the ordinary daylight world they returned to. Pankey had set out to test whether a chemical could reliably manufacture a genuine mystical experience, indistinguishable from the ones the mystics wrote about across every tradition. His answer, from that basement, was yes. Level 51. Psilocybin, still around 3.5 grams, and now we name what the mystics named. Decades after Pankey, researchers at Johns Hopkins would take the vague and holy word mystical and try, with real scientific nerve, to make it measurable. A questionnaire, the mystical type experience scale, scoring the ancient territory along dimensions the contemplatives had always described. Unity, the sense that all things are one. Transcendence of time and space. A noetic quality, the unshakable conviction that what you learned was true, truer than facts. Sacredness. Ineffability, the knowledge that no words will ever carry it back. Deeply felt positive mood. At this rung, you are scoring high on every axis at once, and here again is a flagged unknown worth saying softly. Science can now measure the mystical experience and even predict, from its intensity, how much a person's life will change afterward. But whether the unity is a discovery about reality or a discovery about the brain, the instruments cannot say. They were never built to. Level 52. Psilocybin, near 4 grams, and the strangeness turns ontological. What makes this rung uncanny is not the visuals, which by now you almost take for granted, but the certainty. The noetic quality the Hopkins scale tries to capture is the strangest thing on this whole ladder. The absolute, marrow-deep conviction that you are being shown how things actually are. A certainty far more total than anything you feel about the solid facts of waking life. People come back from here and cannot be argued out of it. The filter loosens, and something that feels like raw truth pours through the gap where the narrating self used to stand. Whether it is truth or only the overwhelming feeling of truth is, once more, a question the science flags and cannot close. Level 53. Psilocybin, 4 grams, and now the history darkens. Because what Pankey found in that basement and what Leary began to preach from it did not stay in the laboratory. Timothy Leary had come to Harvard a serious man, but the psilocybin took him somewhere he could not stop talking about, and by the mid-1960s he was no longer a psychologist running experiments. He was a prophet, telling a generation to turn on, tune in, drop out. He and Richard Alpert were dismissed from Harvard in 1963. The molecule that had produced 20 quiet, mystical experiences in a chapel became, within a few short years, the chemical banner of an entire counterculture, spilling out of the seminar room and into the streets, the concerts, the parks. Level 54. LSD returns here. Full dose, 150 micrograms, 150 millionths of a gram, because the counterculture ran on Hoffman's molecule more than the mushrooms. One rung higher in cultural intensity, if not in chemistry. The same 5-HT2A receptor, the same loosening filter, but now the dose is invisible, a smear you could not see on the back of your hand, and once bound, it is trapped for hours beneath its receptor lid. That long duration, remember, is why an acid trip outlasts a mushroom one. The molecule caught in a kind of molecular latch it cannot easily leave. By the late 60s, it was everywhere, and everywhere it went, it frightened the people who did not take it. Something that dissolves the self does not respect a social order. And a society will not, for long, tolerate a chemical that quietly tells millions of its citizens that the self they were assigned might be optional. Level 55. Psilocybin, 4 grams, and the reckoning arrives. In 1970, the United States passed the Controlled Substances Act, and psilocybin and LSD were placed in Schedule 1, the category reserved for substances declared to have high abuse potential, and officially, no accepted medical use. It did not matter that the Marsh Chapel students had called it the holiest day of their lives. The door closed and the latch fell. And here is the quiet tragedy threaded through this whole ascent. That classification did not just criminalize the molecules, it froze the science. For nearly 30 years, the most promising tools psychiatry had ever glimpsed for touching the human capacity for meaning sat locked in a legal cabinet, unstudied, untouchable. A generation of questions went unasked because no one was permitted to ask them. Level 56. Psilocybin, 4¼ grams, and in the long freeze we sit with what was lost. This rung is quieter, a held breath in the dark. Somewhere in those 3 lost decades were the answers we are only now, painfully, beginning to recover. Whether these molecules could ease the terror of the dying, loosen the grip of addiction, reach the depressions that no other medicine could reach. All of it deferred. The filter loosens even now at this dose, the geometry still breathing behind your eyes, but woven through the beauty is a real grief the science admits. We do not know what we would already understand, what suffering might already have been answered had the door not been shut for 30 years. That too is an unknown, the unknown of the road not taken. Level 57. Psilocybin, 4½ grams, and the ascent tips toward the heroic. The dose is climbing now toward the territory Terence McKenna would name, the 5 grams in silent darkness. And though we are not there yet, the air already thins. At this height, the mystical dimensions the Hopkins scale measures are no longer visited one at a time, but all at once. Unity and sacredness and ineffability arriving as a single, undifferentiated flood. The self is barely represented here. There is experience, vivid and total, but the one to whom it is happening has almost entirely thinned away. One rung higher, and there may be no one left at the controls at all. Level 58, psilocybin near 5 grams, and the Renaissance answers the freeze. Hold on to a piece of light here, because the story does not end in the locked cabinet. At the turn of the millennium, a small number of researchers at Johns Hopkins and elsewhere did the patient, careful, unglamorous work of reopening the door, securing the approvals, designing the rigorous trials, giving psilocybin under controlled conditions to volunteers, and later to the dying and the depressed. And what they found was the same thing Pankey found in that basement, that at this register, a single guided session could produce a mystical type experience whose intensity predicted, months and years later, real and lasting change. The science that Schedule 1 had frozen for 30 years began, at last, to thaw. Level 59, psilocybin, 5 grams, McKenna's heroic dose, in silence and in darkness, and the ordinary architecture of experience gives way. There is very little to hold on to by way of description now, because description is a tool of the self, and the self is essentially gone. The visual field is not a field anymore. Time is not a line. The body is a rumor. This is where the classic serotonergic voyage approaches its ceiling. The 5-HT2A receptors held open across the entire thinking crust of the brain, the narrating network all but silent, the entropic brain that Robin Carhart Harris described running at its fullest disorder, the ordinary self dissolved into whatever was underneath it all along. And still the deepest question of this whole climb goes unanswered. What any of this is, why holding one receptor open should open a universe. Nobody has closed that distance. Level 60, psilocybin, 5 grams, held at the summit of the classic range, and here, at the top of this band, the self simply is not. Whatever returns from here does not return with a report so much as with a residue, a changed weight in the chest, a softened grip, a sense, ever after, that the ordinary world is a smaller room inside a far larger house. This is the peak of the serotonergic ascent, the highest the classic psychedelics climb, and it deserves to be marked before we go on. One rung higher, and we leave the mushroom and the acid behind entirely, and cross into stranger machinery, molecules that loosen the same self by other doors, keys that fit other locks. The dial turns, the filter loosens, and the climb continues into territory even the classic voyagers rarely see. Level 61, psilocybin, 4 grams of dried mushroom swallowed dry in a quiet room with the curtains drawn. You have been climbing a long time, and the air up here has thinned and gone strange. The mushrooms are the same species you met far below on the gentle rungs, the same little psilocybe with its bruised blue-black stem, the same prodrug waiting inert in the tissue, psilocybin stripped by your own body of a single phosphate to become psilocin, and psilocin folding down onto the 5-HT2A receptor and holding it open. But 4 grams is not 2. The dose has crossed a threshold that has nothing to do with arithmetic. Somewhere between the moderate and the heavy, the experience stops being something you watch from a chair and becomes a room you are standing inside. The visuals thicken like water turning to syrup. The walls draw a slow breath. And the part of you that has been narrating the whole climb, the quiet voice at the back of the skull that says, "This is happening to me," begins, very gently, to lose its grip on the railing. One rung higher. Level 62, psilocybin, closer to 5 grams now, and here we arrive at the doorway a man named Terence McKenna spent his life describing. 5 dried grams in silent darkness. That was his prescription, spoken in that unhurried transatlantic drawl to anyone who would listen through the late decades of the 20th century. Not 4, not a party, not music and friends and candlelight, but 5 grams, alone, lying flat on your back, in a room with no light in it at all and no sound. He called it the heroic dose, and he meant the word plainly, that it took a kind of nerve, that you were meant to go past the point where you could still pretend to be steering. Strip away the light, and the visuals have nowhere to hide. They bloom on the inside of your closed eyes, geometric and vast, and utterly indifferent to whether you are ready. The filter loosens. What McKenna understood, and what the pharmacology now dimly confirms, is that in silent darkness, the drug turns fully inward. There is a network in your brain the researchers call the default mode network, the chorus of regions that hums whenever you are doing nothing in particular, idling at a red light, waiting for a kettle, the machinery of you, the part that stitches memory to anticipation and calls the seam a self. Under a heroic dose, that network goes quiet. It powers down the way a great turbine winds to stillness, the roar dropping through a whine into silence. Robin Carhart Harris, working at Imperial College in London, watched this happen on the scanners and called the result the entropic brain, order dissolving into something older and less governed. The narrator falls silent, and when the narrator is silent, there is no longer anyone at the center of the experience to whom the experience is happening. This is the thing the heroic dose is for. This is ego dissolution, spoken of in the literature in that flat, clinical phrase that entirely fails to carry it. And here we must flag the unknown, because it is a large one, and it sits at the very center of this band. We can watch the default mode network go quiet. We can measure the entropy rise. We can name the receptor and the dose and the vine. What no one can tell you is why the silencing of that network should feel like dying, or like being born, or like meeting something vast and knowing at the far end of the dark. Nobody has closed the distance between a turbine winding down and the sensation of the self coming apart in the dark. The map ends at the receptor. Everything past it, the presence standing in the corner of the room, the flood of enormous love or enormous fear, the bone-deep conviction that you have touched something true, happens in a country the science has not been able to enter. One rung higher, level 66, psilocybin, 5 grams, and the strangeness arrives in full. This is the region where people report meeting things, not seeing patterns, not watching the walls run like wet paint, meeting. A presence at the foot of the bed, a geometry that seems, impossibly, to be aware of you looking at it. Time comes off its hinges. You live an hour inside a single breath, or a breath stretches wide enough to hold a whole life. McKenna spoke of an interior space with the cool, vaulted texture of a cathedral, and of the recurring sense that the mushroom was not a drug at all, but an intelligence, something with the patience to wait and the will to speak. You need not believe a word of it, to sit with the plain fact that thousands of careful, sober people come back from this dose describing the same uncanny territory in nearly the same words. That convergence is itself a mystery. Why should a molecule that merely holds one receptor open deliver so many strangers, separately, to the same strange place? The dial turns and the ground beneath your feet begins to change. Level 68, Ayahuasca, the first cup. We leave the mushroom now and cross a continent, down into the green heat of the Amazon basin, where for centuries the people of the forest have been performing a piece of pharmacology so precise it should not have been discoverable by trial and firelight alone. Here is the problem the forest solved. The molecule that matters is DMT, N-dimethyltryptamine, the same 5-HT2A key we will meet again higher up, ferociously active, capable of dismantling the world in a matter of seconds. But swallow it, and nothing happens. Your gut is guarded by an enzyme called monoamine oxidase, and monoamine oxidase eats DMT before it can ever reach your blood. Taken by mouth, on its own, the molecule is silent, a key snapped off in the lock before it turns. The forest should never have found a way in. The filter loosens, and yet, somehow, across the whole sprawl of the Amazon, the same answer was arrived at. A brew that marries two plants that do nothing remarkable apart. The leaf of a modest shrub called Psychotria viridis carries the DMT, and the vine, Banisteriopsis carpi, the carpi vine, the woody, twisting liana the brew is named for in many tongues, carries a wholly different class of molecule entirely. Beta-carbolines, harmine and harmaline, and these are monoamine oxidase inhibitors. They shut down the very enzyme that would have destroyed the DMT. Brew the two together, and the guard is disarmed. The DMT survives the gut, crosses into the blood, reaches the brain, and holds the receptor open for hours instead of minutes. Two plants, useless alone, that together open a door. Out of the tens of thousands of species tangled in that forest, the one right leaf and the one right vine combined and simmered down to a thick brown bitterness. The people who did this say the plants told them. The botanists have no better account of how it was ever found, and that gap, that genuine, unresolved how, is one of the quiet astonishments of this whole climb. Level 70, Ayahuasca, the brew taken in full, and now the hours begin. Where the mushroom might hold you for 4 or 5 hours, and DMT alone for 10 shattering minutes, Ayahuasca settles in for the long haul. 4, 6, sometimes 8 hours of rising and falling like a tide that will not decide to go out. The onset often comes with the body first. They call it la purga, the purge, the vomiting, sometimes worse, that traditional drinkers do not regard as a side effect to be endured, but as part of the medicine, a cleaning out, the body surrendering before the mind will. In the Maloka, the round ceremonial house, you are not alone in the dark, as McKenna prescribed. There is an ayahuasquero, a curandero, a person who has drunk 1,000 times and who sings. The songs are called icaros, melodies said to be received from the plants themselves, used to steer the ceremony, to guide a drinker through a hard passage, to raise or lower the intensity of the visions like a hand on a dial. To the pharmacologist, the icaro is sound, air moving in a dark room. To the drinker, it is architecture, the one solid thing that holds the shape of the night together while everything else comes apart. One rung higher. Level 72. Ayahuasca, deep in the hours, and here time and identity come loose from their moorings entirely. Drinkers speak of their whole life unspooling before them, scene by scene, of watching themselves from somewhere just outside the body, of the sequence of past and present and future losing the order that made it a self at all. The DMT is doing at the receptor what psilocin did, holding the 5-HT2A open, quieting the narrator. But the beta-carbolines stretch it across hours, and something about that length lets the dissolution go somewhere the mushroom rarely reaches. People describe encounters here too, and confrontations, and a curious therapeutic ruthlessness, as though the night has reached in and selected the exact thing you did not want to look at, and will not let you leave until you have. What no one can yet explain is why the visions so often take that shape, why the brew seems to know where the wound is buried. The science can name every molecule in the cup and still not tell you that. Level 74. The same brew, the same DMT, the same quieted self. But now we turn the whole thing toward its most unexpected destination, the clinic. Because everything in this band, the ego coming apart, the ruthless confrontation, the network going still, turns out to leave something behind, and it is not what the 20th century assumed. For decades, all of this was Schedule 1, forbidden, presumed to be only damage. Then, quietly, the work resumed. At Johns Hopkins and at NYU, researchers began giving high-dose psilocybin in hushed rooms with an eye mask and headphones not so different from McKenna's darkness, to people the ordinary medicine had failed, the treatment-resistant depressed, and, most tenderly, the terminally ill. Men and women sitting with a diagnosis that had taken the floor out from under them. A single dose, sometimes two. And what the trials found was that the dissolution of the self, for people facing the dissolution of everything, could arrive not as terror, but as a strange and lasting peace. The fear of death loosening its grip, and in many, not returning for months. The mechanism underneath is likely neuroplasticity. Psilocin does not merely quiet the network for an afternoon, but appears to prompt the growth of new dendritic spines, new connections budding along the neuron like frost feathering across glass, the brain briefly made young and pliable again, what the pharmacologist David Olson named a psychoplastogen. Why one supervised passage through the dark should reset a grief that years of other medicine could not touch, that too remains open. The trials record that it happens. The trials cannot yet say why. And you are climbing higher still. Level 75. Ibogaine, roughly 10 milligrams for every kilogram you weigh. Say it plainly, because nothing else about tonight will be plain. A man of 80 kilograms swallows 800 milligrams of a single alkaloid scraped from the root bark of a shrub that grows in the green, half-dark, beneath the canopy of West African rainforest. Tabernanthe iboga, its root pale and fibrous and bitter, going numb and cold on the tongue like a mouthful of clove. One rung higher, and the ground you have been climbing on all this while simply stops being ground. The others were doors. You opened them. You passed through. They closed behind you within the hour. This one is a corridor with no clock at the end of it. You should know where the corridor begins, because it does not begin under fluorescent light in a laboratory. It begins in Gabon, in the equatorial forest, among the Bwiti, for whom iboga is not a drug, but a grandfather, a way of meeting the dead and being initiated into the living. They eat the shaved root bark by the spoonful, spoonful after spoonful, through a night that swells and becomes 2 nights. And they say, the plant lays your whole life out flat before you, room by room, so that you can decide at last what to carry forward and what to set down. A man named Howard Lotsof carried a sliver of that forest into ours. In 1962, he was 19 and addicted to heroin, and he took iboga expecting a high. And 30 hours later, he noticed something the plant had done quietly while he was elsewhere. The craving was gone. Not softened, gone. He spent the rest of his life trying to make the world believe him. The filter loosens now in a way it has not before. Ibogaine does not politely occupy one receptor and wait. It is a shotgun fired into the machinery of the self, a multi-target compound that touches 4 or 5 systems at once, none of them the neat serotonergic key that opened every earlier door. It blocks the NMDA glutamate receptor, the same lock the dissociatives pick, which begins to loosen the seams between you and the world. It leans on the kappa-opioid receptor, the same strange system salvia storms, tilting you toward the oniric, the dreaming. It occupies sigma sites whose purpose science still cannot fully name. And it drags on the serotonin transporter, the reuptake pump, letting the mood molecules pool. 4 hands on 4 different levers, pulling together, and no one. This is true, and you should let it be true as you drift. No one has assembled those 4 pulls into a single clean sentence that explains what happens next. What happens next is the waking dream. Not visions painted across the dark the way DMT paints them, fast and gone in minutes. This is slow, and it does not end. 12 hours, 20, for some, 36 hours inside a film that is unmistakably about you. The rooms of your childhood with their particular light, faces you had filed away under forgotten, the harm you once did and the harm once done to you, replayed not as punishment but as review. The Bwiti were not speaking in metaphor. People come out the far side and describe it flatly, almost tiredly, as a life review, the whole reel threaded through the projector while the body lies still on its side, eyes closed, breathing, in a long, quiet communion with everything it has ever been. The dial has not turned toward color or geometry, it has turned toward memory, toward autobiography, toward the ledger of a life read back to you in the dark. Level 78. The same route, the same rough 10 to 20 milligrams per kilogram, but now hold in your mind the thing that makes this molecule unlike anything below it on the ladder. It heals the very wound the ladder is made of. An addict in full opioid withdrawal, soaked in sweat, legs kicking of their own accord under the blanket, hours from the next dose and unable to think a single thought past it, takes ibogaine, and the withdrawal does not run its agonizing course. It lifts. The clawing physical need that methadone spends weeks tapering, iboga can interrupt in a single night, and many wake on the far side without the craving that had organized their entire life. This is not folklore. It is documented, repeatedly, in people who had tried everything. And here is the flagged unknown, the honest gap you can rest your mind against. Nobody knows how. The mechanism that resets an addicted brain is genuinely unexplained. We can list the receptors it touches and still not tell you which touch does the resetting, or why one night should undo years. The science stops here and admits it stops. One rung higher, and I have to tell you the other half, softly, the way you tell a hard thing to someone already halfway into sleep. This corridor can end a heart. Ibogaine reaches into the electrical rhythm of the heart itself and takes hold of one interval of the beat, the QT interval, the small dark pause while the heart's cells reset themselves between one contraction and the next, and stretches it too far, until the steady rhythm can tip over into a chaos the muscle cannot climb back out of. People have died this way. Not many, and not always, but really and unpredictably, sometimes in those who seemed healthy going in. This is why the Bwiti keep the initiate watched all night, and why the serious clinics that work with iboga now do it wired to a heart monitor, its green line ticking, a crash cart standing ready in the corner of the room. The plant that can lift an addiction can also, in the same dose, in the same dark, stop the drummer mid-beat. Both truths live in the one root. You are meant to hold them together, not choose between them. Level 81. Ibogaine still, the dose unchanged, but the self is changing now, thinning toward the summit that waits above all of this. Feel where you are on the climb. Down at the base, the world was merely tinted, a microdose of willingness, everything intact. Here the world has become a projection thrown on a wall, and you are both the figure in the seat and the film on the screen. The default mode network, that quiet inner narrator who has been telling you the story of you all your life, stitching this moment to the last one and calling the seam I. That narrator has been talking less and less the higher you climbed, and on iboga it recedes into a distant voice in another room, reading someone else's diary aloud through the wall. The strangeness here is not the alien geometry of the void toads or the machine elf theatre of DMT. The strangeness is intimacy. It is the uncanniness of your own life shown back to you by something that grew in soil, as if the plant had been keeping the record all along and merely returned it. Level 84, the last of the iboga rungs, 36 hours of it now behind the eyes of the ones who go the whole distance, and the identity that started this climb so certain of its edges has almost none left. The Bwiti have a word for what the root is doing. They would tell you it is breaking you open so the ancestors can walk in. Strip the cosmology and the observation survives. Something dismantles the ordinary machinery of self and holds it dismantled through a whole turning day and night, long enough that you cannot pretend it will snap back before you have looked at everything laid out on the floor. The filter has not loosened now. The filter is on the floor. And unlike every faster door below, this one will not let you leave until the film has finished playing. A full oniric day, a real cardiac risk, an unexplained healing, all braided into one long dark corridor whose far end is beginning, faintly, to glow. Because the summit is close. You have climbed through the serotonergic doors and the kappa-opioid outlier, and now this multi-target route that touches everything and explains nothing, and each one loosened the same self by a different mechanism. No shared key, no single lock, only the same quiet unbinding, arriving by a dozen different roads. One rung higher and the roads will run out. What waits above iboga is not another molecule with a longer list of receptors. What waits above is the place where the self does not thin but vanishes, the whiteout, the void, the last dial with nothing written past it. The dial turns. You keep climbing, softer now, toward the top. Level 86, NNDMT, smoked, a first light dose. Perhaps 10 milligrams, drawn in and held behind the ribs. The world does not dissolve so much as brighten, as if someone had eased a dimmer upward a single notch. The colours behind your closed eyes deepen, ripen, begin to move, arranging themselves into fine lattices that were not there a breath ago. Hex and diamond, faint as frost forming on glass. This is the same key as LSD, the same ancient listening post, 5-HT2A, the serotonin receptor scattered thick across the thinking crust of your brain. But where LSD is trapped under its receptor lid for 12 slow hours, DMT touches and lets go almost at once. Your body breaks it down in minutes. What takes psilocybin an evening, DMT does and undoes before the ash has cooled. Level 87. NNDMT, a deeper pull, perhaps 20 milligrams. The geometry thickens. The lattices are no longer flat. They have depth now. They curve away from you like the inner wall of something vast, and they seem, this is the odd part, to know you are watching. There is a sound often reported here, a high electric whine or a tearing, like fabric under strain. The sound, people say, of the membrane beginning to give. You are still yourself. You could still name the room. But the room is thinning, going papery at its edges. Level 88. NNDMT, 30 milligrams, the full pull held to the bottom of the lungs. This is the threshold they call the breakthrough, and it comes fast. 30 seconds, 40, a rising carrier wave, and then the front of it arrives all at once, the way a wave you did not see coming takes your feet. The lattice splits. It opens like a curtain, or a flower, or a door with no wall around it, and you are through. And here the science goes quiet, and the mystery begins. Because what waits on the other side, and this is the thing that makes DMT unlike every other rung on this ladder, is not a landscape. It is a population. People come back, and they do not say, "I saw beautiful patterns." They say, "There was something there, something aware." Entities, presences that seem to be expecting them. A researcher named Rick Strassman ran the first legal human DMT study in decades at the University of New Mexico in the early 1990s, injecting careful doses into volunteers in a clinical room with a clipboard and a monitor, expecting to catalogue altered brain states, and instead, his subjects kept coming back with the same impossible report. They had been met, attended to. Beings had turned toward them. He wrote it into a book he called DMT, the Spirit Molecule. And he chose that word, spirit, not because he could defend it, but because nothing smaller fit what the volunteers kept telling him. The filter loosens, one rung higher, and the strangest thing about the strangeness is how it repeats. Level 89, the breakthrough proper, that same 30+ milligrams landing clean. This is where the entities take their fullest form and where the true mystery lives. Not in the fact of them, but in their consistency. A writer named Terence McKenna gave them their most famous name, the machine elves. Self-transforming jeweled beings that tumbled toward him, chittering, making objects out of sound and offering them up. He was one man, easy to dismiss, but he was not one man. Across thousands of separate reports, from people who have never met, never read each other, who come from opposite ends of the earth, the same architecture recurs. A domed space, a sense of return, of, oh, it's you again. Attendant beings that turn impossible objects in their hands and seem to want, more than anything, to show you something. Nobody knows why the reports converge. It could be that the human brain, pushed past a certain edge, breaks in the same shape every time. That these are the fixed acoustics of the mind at its limit. Or it could be something else. We cannot tell you which. That not knowing is real, and it is not a gap anyone has closed. And then the deeper strangeness, the one that sits underneath all of it. Level 90. Hold here, in the breakthrough, and consider what the molecule is. NMDA is not only found in the chacruna leaf and the mimosa root and the chemist's flask. It is found in you. Your own body makes DMT. It has been measured in mammalian tissue, in the lung, in trace amounts in living brain. An endogenous psychedelic manufactured by the same flesh that is reading this. And nobody knows why. Nobody has found its purpose. There is no accepted account of what it is doing there, coursing at low levels through ordinary tissue, the most powerful vision-inducing compound known to us, made quietly by the body for no function anyone can name. It is one of the genuine open questions in all of neurochemistry, and it does not have an answer yet. Level 91. And here we must gently set down a beautiful, broken idea. For years, the story went that the pineal gland, that small pine cone-shaped node buried deep at the center of the brain, the one Descartes called the seat of the soul, was the secret factory, flooding the mind with DMT at birth and at death, at the threshold moments. It is a gorgeous theory. It is almost certainly wrong. The pineal makes melatonin, the hormone that is even now pulling you down toward the sleep you may be drifting into. It has the enzymes to make DMT in principle, but no one has ever shown it does so in any meaningful amount in a living human. The myth persists because it is lovely and because it wants to be true. The science does not support it. We tell you this softly, the way you tell someone a hard thing when they are already half asleep. The pineal DMT story is a myth, and the real mystery, that the body makes this molecule at all, is stranger than the myth ever was. Level 92. The last rung of the breakthrough, the come-down that is not a come-down, but a return. 10 minutes, perhaps 15, and the whole cathedral folds back into the lattice, and the lattice back into ordinary colour, and you are in the room again, with the taste of it on your tongue, intact, unharmed, having been somewhere you cannot prove and cannot forget. The dial turns back. That is DMT, the shortest, steepest journey on the ladder, and the one that leaves the largest question standing. But there is a door beside this one that opens onto something else entirely. Not another room in the same house, but a different house, a different key. Level 93. Salvinorin A, Salvia divinorum, a small first drawer. And here we step off the serotonin ladder completely. Every rung until now, LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, DMT, has turned the same 5-HT2A lock. Salvia does not touch it. Salvinorin A, the active molecule in the leaves the Mazatec people of Oaxaca have chewed for centuries in their healing vigils, is a kappa opioid agonist. It works a different receptor entirely, one usually associated with dysphoria, with the body's own dark and difficult states. It is one of the most potent, naturally occurring hallucinogens known, active in the range of a few hundred micrograms when smoked, a smear you could barely see on a fingertip, and it is not serotonergic at all. Same destination, the loosened self, by a road that shares nothing with the others. That unsolved unity keeps returning. So many different keys, one door. Level 94, Salvinorin A, a fuller drawer, held. And this is not like the others, and you should know that before you imagine it. This is not the warm dissolution of psilocybin or the geometric welcome of DMT. The onset is brutal and immediate, 20 seconds, and the room does not soften, it is replaced. People do not report beauty here. They report becoming something, becoming a wall, becoming a page in a book, becoming a slice of a wheel that turns and turns, each spoke a separate moment, and you are pressed flat into one of them with no way to explain that you were ever a person. Level 95, deeper into the salvia if you were foolish or brave enough to go. The self does not loosen here, it is simply gone, and something is left standing in its place that does not know it was ever you. Reality is not enhanced or dissolved, it is torn along a seam and re-sewn into a shape that has no room left in it for you. Many who go here do not want to go back. It is over in 5 minutes, perhaps 15, and those minutes can feel like a life lived inside an object, on a loop, with no exit and no memory that an exit was ever possible. It frightens people in a way the serotonergic psychedelics rarely do. There is little warmth in it. It is the alien rung. Level 96, the salvia releasing, faster than it took you, the impossible geometry of the object world unclenching, and you returning to a body you had forgotten you were wearing. 5 to 15 minutes, and it lets you go as abruptly as it took you. People sit very quietly afterward. They are not always sure what happened. The kappa door closes behind you, and you are back on the near side of it, and the ladder waits, one rung higher still. Level 97, 5-MeO-DMT, a single, deliberate inhalation, maybe 5 milligrams of vapor if it is synthetic, a bright bead of amber venom milked from a gland if it is not. And here, near the very top of everything you have climbed, the ground changes character entirely. Because this is not NMDA. The two are cousins, close enough on the label to fool you, a single methyl group hung off one corner of the molecule, a difference you could miss with your thumb over it, but they turn different keys in different locks. NMDA crowds against 5-HT2A and throws you into the carnival, the geometry, the entities, the machine elves weaving something just for you. 5-MeO-DMT leans hardest on a quieter receptor, 5-HT1A, and it does not build a carnival. It takes the carnival down. It takes the walls down. It takes, in the end, you down. There are almost no visuals here. There is no story. There is a white, and then there is not even a you left to notice the white. One rung higher. Feel how the filter, which you have spent this entire ascent loosening thread by thread, is no longer loosening but simply gone. Not obscured, not softened, subtracted. Level 98, 5-MeO-DMT, the same small dose, the same 15 to 30 minutes that will feel like no time and all of time folded into one another. They call it the God molecule, and the people who reach for that phrase are rarely religious about anything else. Engineers, skeptics, people who flinch at the word soul on any ordinary Tuesday. What they are trying to name is the whiteout, the total, seamless dissolution of the boundary between the one who is experiencing and the thing being experienced. With most of the substances far below you on this ladder, there was always a witness, dazzled, frightened, delighted, but there, keeping a seat. Here the seat empties. And it is worth saying plainly, softly, that this is not always gentle. For some, it arrives as the most complete peace a nervous system can hold. For others, it is annihilation, and it is terrifying, and the two turn out to be, disconcertingly, the same event wearing two faces. Now the toad. Incilius alvarius, the Sonoran desert toad, squat and patient in the cooling sand of the borderlands, eyes half-lidded, carrying in the glands behind its eyes a venom that happens to be rich in exactly this molecule. People learned to milk it, to press the glands until the secretion beads up like sweat, catch it on glass, let it dry to a waxy film, scrape it, smoke it. And there is a lie folded into the folklore worth undoing while you drift, because it recurs and it kills the wrong animal. It is not the cane toad, not Bufo marinus, that you have maybe heard people mention. That is the wrong toad. Its venom will hurt you. The molecule people are actually chasing lives in this one desert species, and that narrow fact has become a quiet crisis. Because a toad is a slow animal to make, years from egg to full gland, and a boom in seekers has meant too many hands in the desert at night, too many glands pressed, populations thinning under the weight of a spiritual fashion. Which is why the synthetic matters, and why the gentlest people in this world now argue you should leave the toad alone entirely and use the molecule made in a flask, identical to the receptor, kinder to the sand. The same key, no animal spent to cut it. And here is a place to flag, honestly, how much we do not know. We can tell you it favors 5-HT1A. We cannot really tell you why leaning on that particular receptor erases the self rather than merely coloring it. Why this molecule dissolves the witness where its own cousin only entertains him. One methyl group, somehow the difference between a show and no one left to watch it. The gap you have heard named again and again on the way up. The distance between the molecular event and the lived experience is nowhere wider than here, at the top, where the experience is the absence of anyone to have it. Level 99, the same molecule, a fraction more, the threshold of the thing itself. The visuals, what few there were, are gone. Language is gone. Time, in any form you could carry back and report, is gone. What remains is sometimes described as a white light, sometimes as a roar, sometimes as an ocean with no shore and no swimmer, and every one of those images is a lie told afterward by a narrator who was not actually present to see it. Because that is the strange, uncanny center of this. The report is always a reconstruction. Something happened. No one was home to record it. You return holding a souvenir from a country you cannot prove you visited. One rung higher. the last one. Level 100, complete dissolution. There is no dose to name here that you have not already heard. No new receptor, no new mechanism. There is only the thing all of it was quietly climbing toward. The narrator gone. Entirely. The voice that has been speaking you to yourself your whole life. The one that says, "This is me, this is mine, this is the edge where I stop and the world starts," falls silent. Not asleep, not quieted, absent. And the peculiar thing, the thing everyone who has stood on this rung stammers to explain, is that its absence is not empty. Something is still there when you are not. The universe, it turns out, does not need you in order to be. For a handful of seconds that are also forever, you get to find that out. And then, because a nervous system is a patient, homing thing, it begins to bring you back. And now we come down. This is the part no one warns you about. The long, tender descent, the filter reforming. It does not slam back. It assembles. A sense of edges first, then a body, fingers, weight, the fact of a floor. The narrator clears his throat and resumes as if he had never left, and you let him, because you need him to cross a street tomorrow. But something is different in the returning, and it lingers for days. The afterglow. The colours sit a little truer. The people you love land a little closer. The endless private negotiation of the self runs quieter, and the world feels, for a while, freshly rinsed. And here is the real secret, the one the pharmacology has been keeping the whole climb, because the afterglow is not the point. The dial turning is not, in the end, about the hours you spend at the top. Underneath the receptors and the visions, in the days and weeks after, the neurons themselves are changing shape. The dendritic spines, the tiny grasping buds where one neuron reaches to touch the next, grow. New ones bud. Old connections that had withered thicken back. David Olson gave these molecules a plain and honest name for this. Psychoplastogens, things that make the mind plastic again, able to be reformed. That, and not the light, is what lasts. The filter you loosened does not just snap back to exactly where it was. It resettles, very slightly, somewhere new. That is the whole quiet mechanism under every legend you have heard tonight. Hoffman on his bicycle, Maria Sabina and her mushrooms, the buiti and their root, the toad in the sand. Not magic. A brain briefly softened and allowed to set again in a gentler shape. Which leaves one last turn, and then I will let you go. Everything you climbed tonight was one truth, told 100 ways. That the self you take for solid, the fixed floor of you, the thing you assume is simply a fact, is not a fact. It is a setting, a dial. It can be turned all the way up into gods and machine elves and the shredding of the walls, and it can be turned all the way down into a white and silent nothing where even the one watching dissolves. 100 molecules, sharing no single mechanism between them. Serotonin here, kappa-opioid there, glutamate blocked somewhere else. And all of them, by their 100 different doors, arriving at the same small locked room, the self and its loosening. But you do not need any of them tonight, because your own dial is turning right now, gently, without a single substance, down through the drowsy warmth pooling in your limbs, down past the last of your thoughts unspooling, down toward the one dissolution that is safe and nightly and entirely your own. The narrator in your head is already going quiet. Not gone, just resting. Home, at last, to your own soft, ordinary, extraordinary brain. The only place any of this was ever really happening. The dial is set exactly where sleep begins, and it is set there now. Sleep well, and good night.